unregulated militia be necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Welcome to another edition of Bearing Arms, Cam and Company. My name is Cam Edwards. Glad you're with me on the program today. Day before Election Day, and we are not taking a look at a swing state today. Actually, we're going to be taking a look at maybe the furthest thing from a swing state, the state of Massachusetts, where the last time I saw a poll, Kamala Harris leading Donald Trump by like 20-something points. Democrats had complete control of the state legislature, complete control of every statewide office, and unfortunately, I don't think that's going to change tomorrow. But I wanted to have Jim Wallace from the Gun Owners Action League on the show today. It's maybe a warning, the ghost of things to come, perhaps, if we have a Kamala Harris presidency, because we know that not only would the Harris-Walz administration try to Californicate our gun control laws, honestly, Governor Maura Healey, she could be the next Attorney General of the United States. She is a Harris campaign surrogate, and I expect that she would be in line for the Attorney Generalship if Harris wins tomorrow. Maura Healey was previously the Attorney General of Massachusetts before being elected governor. So I could see her going to Washington and heading up the DOJ, in which case you would have, well, I think regardless, if Harris wins, you're going to have an anti-gunner in charge of the Department of Justice. But it could very well be the governor of Massachusetts who, again, signed this emergency preamble 2 months after she signed the state's latest gun control bill, which is now being challenged in court with at least one lawsuit and many more in the wings. So wanted to have Jim Wallace on to talk about, again, the dangers that are lurking for gun owners. If Kamala Harris wins election tomorrow, and all of the nonsense that Massachusetts gun owners are having to deal with right now as a result of the Democrats' anti-gun agenda. So take a look and listen to our conversation with Jim Wallace of the Gun Owners Action League. Jim Wallace, thank you so much for coming on the program today. It's good to see you, sir.
We're deep within our bunker here in the state of Massachusetts as the battleground state it is. So, wow, I never thought as a kid I would see this state become what it is now. But, we're fighting. We're not giving up, because if we give up here, then they're going to take that show on the road somewhere else, and it just spreads from there.
Well, absolutely. And in fact, I think we can look at Massachusetts as sort of, a warning for gun owners around the country, right? If they need any more motivation to go to the polls, just look at what happens when Democrats have complete control of state government, right? And what they say is reasonable, what they say is common sense, right? Chapter 135 is not reasonable. There's no common sense involved. We have seen this legislature make it up as they go along, both in terms of the language of this bill and the process of enacting this law. So, again, if you're on the fence about whether or not you're going to vote, who you're voting for, and you're a Second Amendment supporter, just look at Massachusetts and everything that you are having to deal with right now, Jim.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. I've said this publicly many times. The mistake the proponents of this made was they went after every part of the Second Amendment community, all of us. And in past, they would try to separate us, like a cheetah that separates one animal from the herd, and take it down. The rest of the herd just goes off running, going, see ya. This time they went after everybody. They went after the hunters. They went after the duck hunters. They went after the black powder enthusiasts. They went after the reenactors. So they didn't leave anybody out of this one. And as a result, they've really woken up an entire community of people that didn't think they had to pay attention before, but they do now. And if you think somewhere else in this country that eventually they may not come after you, well, just read our summaries on what has happened here.
Yeah. And again, you talk about that wake-up call. We saw the Civil Rights Coalition turn in more than 90,000 signatures to the Secretary of State, right? I don't know how many of those are going to be certified, but I think it's fair to say well above the 47,000 that's needed to not only put this before the voters 2 years from now in an effort to repeal Chapter 135, but if Governor Maura Healey had not signed that emergency preamble 2 months after she initially signed Chapter 135 into law, the number of signatures that were turned in would have been more than enough to put this law on hold for 2 years.
Right. And it was such an emergency that the same week she signed the emergency preamble, she started to sign suspensions for certain parts of the law. So,
right. Well, again, that goes back to making it up as they go along. Because okay, so we know that the training requirements were pushed back 18 months because they don't have the new training curriculum. The day that she signed the emergency preamble, maybe it was the day before, the Massachusetts State Police told FFLs, okay, listen, even though it says that you can't sell guns that aren't on the roster of approved firearms, go ahead and keep selling some of those guns, but not all of those guns, right? The semi-automatic, the guns we consider assault weapons, you can't sell those, but the bolt-action rifles, the over-under shotguns, okay, you can keep selling those even though there's nothing in the law that says that. We had talked before, Jim, about some of the prohibitions on common carriers, right? Getting these guns to gun stores to sell, and how UPS, FedEx would have to have these locked containers. Has that been suspended as well? Is that just not being enforced? Where is that part of Chapter 135 right now?
Well, that's the whole issue, Cam, is that we have no clue what's being enforced. Because we are now right in I wouldn't say the heart, but it's hunting season now. It has been for a while. And our emails are just blasting away with people asking us, what can I do? I'm a non-resident. What can I do? I'm a resident. What can I do? And the answer is, hell if we know, because the other thing, when you mentioned that training was suspended, it wasn't just the training to get a license that was suspended. The law enforcement training, they were supposed to get trained on this law, and that has been put off for 18 months. The retailers were supposed to receive training on this law. That was put off for 18 months. So you have the state police, you have the local police, you have the environmental police, which is our version of wardens, all of which are saying, we're not being given any guidance as to what we're supposed to enforce here. So the scary thing for non-residents, and you hate to be like this, but folks, I wouldn't come in Massachusetts with a gun this year. I just wouldn't, because they may tell you, well, we're not going to really enforce this, but you're going to take a chance on that and maybe be charged with a felony. I had one gentleman forwarded me an email he got from Fish and Wildlife, and there was no name on the email, but it did come from Fish and Wildlife. And he was inquiring about, well, I have a friend that hunts with me. He lives in New Hampshire, but he comes down and hunt. And the email he got back was, well, we encourage you to go through with your hunting plans with your buddy. And we understand law enforcement is using this year as a learning year. So you can imagine my cell phone, how quick I got on the phone with some people at Fish and Wildlife, that they're putting people at risk. This kind of stuff should never go out from a non-law enforcement agency, especially with no name attached to it. Because what's he supposed to do? Carry a copy of that email in his pocket? When the game warden or even a local police officer stops him and he goes, well, I got this. Well, who's that? I don't know. It came from Fish and Wildlife. That speaks to everything that's going on right now. We don't have any clue. We can tell people what's in the law to some extent. Some of it we can't, because it's just not readable.
Mm-hmm.
Matter of fact, the hunting piece we were trying to figure out again last night, because it kind of says that you have to have a non-resident license to carry to hunt, but then it doesn't. It says that the hunting license kind of takes the place of that, but then it says that, yeah, but your state has to have a similar licensing process as Massachusetts, and the colonel of the state police has to make a list of those states. So we're kind of back to when the purple zebra is laying on its left side during a hailstorm on a Friday in a leap year, you might be able to go hunting with your black powder gun. So it's just, wow.
Yeah, and so you guys at the Gun Owners actually we put on an update last week about the litigation efforts, which is a challenge in and of itself, right? Because the first lawsuit that was filed was challenging those training mandates, and after it was filed, that's when the legislature went back and said, "Okay, we're going to delay this 18 months." I'm guessing in an attempt to try to moot this lawsuit or at least delay it.
Yeah.
What about some of the other portions of Chapter 135 that either are being challenged or will be challenged? I mean, it seems like you're aiming at moving targets here because nothing is set in stone, right? All of this is changeable at the whims of the lawmakers, who would, I think, prefer not to have to defend these things in court for as long as possible. And so instead, they'll make these tweaks, they'll make these changes, they'll delay these things to stave off litigation.
Yeah, the first one we filed was about the training and the licensing regime, as they use that term. So the problem with the licensing regime is at this point, say if you're applying in New Bedford, and they're kind of the infamous one right now, you can't get an appointment till sometime mid-late 2025. So how is the system working? And there are other people across the state that are in that same have that same problem. So while the training might have been delayed, the licensing issue is rampant. So that's something that we desperately want to get in front of a federal judge, because even if Kavanaugh said licensing was okay, they didn't mean that it's going to take you a year to get one.
And even apply for one.
Right. Right. So in the interesting part too is they've set up an online portal. So for the first time, you can apply online. It still goes through your local chief, but you can apply online. Some of the chiefs aren't even recognizing it. So it's like, no, you have to hand me this. So there's a lot there. The second federal action, by the way, the reason we're doing this, just for the listeners, this thing is so huge, no federal court or even state court for that matter is going to take on the whole law. They will not. So you have to break it into very specific subject matters. And we knew that. We've known that for a long time, and we were planning for it. So our next one was about access to firearms. So the long gun roster for the retailers, which you mentioned, I don't think that's ever happened anywhere in the country where every long gun, every model had to go through laboratory safety testing. Even a single shot bolt action 22 Cricket. The manufacturer would have to submit 5 of each of those models to be destroyed. And then if the lab says, okay, then maybe the secretary will put it on a roster. Well, we were going after that because if you can't access guns in common use, the Second Amendment's kind of useless, right?
Right.
So we filed that. We hadn't filed it yet. It's coming. We had announced that was going to be our next one. Almost immediately, the governor said, "Oh, you know what? We're going to send out a guidance letter saying we're not going to enforce that part of it for maybe 18 months or so." So it's a whack-a-mole. Every time we spend money to file suit, they basically try to make it moot. It's really not, but that's what they're thinking. And frankly, that's one of the problems, that even though it's hugely unconstitutional, the courts will look, okay, well, who's been harmed? Are they enforcing it? And if you say, well, no, nobody's really been harmed and nobody's been charged, then it's very difficult for a judge to go, yeah, okay, what do you want me to do? Now,
Right.
things like access, that's a little different, because you can show harm by not being able to access, but then they suspend it. So
Right. But again, they can rescind that suspension at any time, right? It's just a letter, right? It's just guidance.
Yep.
It's not like with the training that was specifically changed by the legislature. They went back and they amended this after the fact. But as you say, with the roster, that was just guidance from the governor and the colonel of the state police.
Yeah.
So again, I mean, you're right. It is whack-a-mole. And it is difficult to show harm. We've seen this, problem with standing before, where even if, and I've seen this, I haven't seen this specifically in Massachusetts, but I've seen cases where think it was the public transportation ban in Washington, D.C. And the judge said, okay, look, even though the plaintiffs say that they, ride the subway in D.C. and they would carry a gun were it not for the fact that this prohibition's in place, and even though the D.C. government says it enforces this prohibition, they really haven't shown that they're at risk of arrest. I mean, like, what more do you need other than being placed in handcuffs before you can say, okay, look, this is a law that impacts me? And some courts have actually gotten that specific. But speaking of courts, I want to ask you about something else, too. I'm sorry I'm ping-ponging around here, but there's a lot to talk about in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
I also wrote about the suitability issue at bearing arms last week, right? Because, again, in Bruin, the Supreme Court said, you can't have these sort of arbitrary and capricious decisions about who gets to carry, right? Shall issue licensing is fine, they said, presumptively constitutional. But again, excessive fees, long delays, maybe they're not as constitutional. But Massachusetts has this suitability rule that seems to just be a way of getting around Bruin, right? Instead of having to show proper cause or a justifiable need to carry a gun, now you have to prove that you're suitable to exercise your Second Amendment rights. And there was a judge, I believe in Boston, who originally denied somebody their license or upheld a denial of a license, and then the next day reversed course and said, actually, you know what? You do have to give this guy his license because the suitability rule, he said, conflicts with Bruin. We've seen some other judges around the state say the same thing. Is that something that Goal has gotten involved in? Is this an issue that you guys are watching? And eventually, is it going to have to be the Massachusetts Supreme Court that decides this? Because from what I understand, all of those have sort of been these are in the state court level, right? These aren't federal challenges at this point.
These are state right now. What happened was we had broad suitability in Massachusetts for an awful long time, and it was problematic. So after Bruin, Chairman Day got so incensed, he didn't have time to do what he did this session, but last year, it was just after Bruin was released, because as I recall the history of it, the legislature was almost ready to be done for the session. So they snuck inside a court IT bill, which almost every legislator was waiting to happen. Their local courts needed updating desperately, to get things going, to keep things going. So they were waiting for this bill. So we snuck in a poison bill to supposedly codify suitability. And he called it, this will meet Bruin. This will pass the Bruin test because we're codifying suitability and what it means. So it was kind of interesting because that morning I had a reporter call me and say, hey, what do you think about this new amendment to the bill? And I'm like, what the heck are you talking about? So I started making some calls and legislators, Jim, we're not voting on anything with guns. Well, actually, you are. You need to get into the state house and figure out what's going on. And everybody to a person's like, Jim, I can't vote against this bill. Everybody wants this bill. We need it desperately. So the poison pill was in it, and supposedly suitability was codified, which emboldened those chiefs that love that. So since then, in just the last 3 or 4 months, we have now 3 separate district court judges in Massachusetts that have ruled suitability to be unconstitutional. So we are involved in 2 of those, may be involved in the third. The one that just came out of Boston is the newest. We're looking at that. And our hope is that most times a pro 2A decision comes out of a district court, the Massachusetts High Court will bypass appeals and bring it right up, like they did for Donnell, the non-resident stuff out of Lowell. So we're hoping that that's what's going to happen. But yeah, we're supporting 2 out of the 3 right now, and potentially the third as well, because it's hugely important that we get this fixed. And some people are a little bit angry because it's like, well, yeah, but that guy did this and that. Yeah, but was he ever convicted? Was there anything that says, okay, you are now a felon, you're disqualified? Can they vote? If they can vote, then, everything else is in place as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
So there's an awful lot there. And so that's on the state level, we're handling those as well. And of course, the Donnell case, we didn't necessarily get involved other than an amicus brief. In that case, non-residents being arrested for not having a license. We're waiting for the high court's decision on that. And that'll tell us a lot. That'll tell us an awful lot about how they address that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, depending on the decision, that could be appealed directly to the Supreme Court. We'll see what the court might do with that. But again, there's always something going on in the Second Amendment battleground state of Massachusetts. And again, we don't want Massachusetts to be replicated at the federal level. So get out there and vote and protect your rights. Jim Wallace from the Gun Owners Action League, as always, my friend, thanks so much for coming on the program. It's good talking with you today.
All right, Cam, as always, deep within the bunker.
We will reach out to you in your undisclosed location again very, very soon. Jim Wallace from the Gun Owners Action League here on Bear Arms, Cam and Company. My thanks to Jim for joining us on the program. We will be talking to him again very soon. There was actually one other lawsuit that we expect maybe to be filed in the next week or two involving a broad coalition of Second Amendment groups. So we'll be having Jim back on the show to talk about that when that litigation drops. Right now, let's turn our attention to today's Armed Citizen story, our good deed of the day, and our recidivist report will start there with a headline out of the Portland, Oregon area. A man arrested on murder and assault allegations in Halloween shooting at Vancouver Mall. And just as in the case of this other high-profile shooting on Halloween, the one in Orlando, Florida, you've got somebody not legally allowed to possess a firearm who police believe is responsible for that shooting. You know, in Florida, Maxwell Frost, the gun control activist turned congressman, blamed Florida's permitless carry for this, I believe, 17-year-old suspect illegally carrying a firearm, allegedly discharging that firearm in the crowd of people, killing 2 and wounding 6 others. For some reason, Maxwell Frost says, well, you know, if Florida didn't have that permitless carry law, this 17-year-old would not have been able to carry a gun. Now, the 17-year-old wasn't able to legally carry the gun to begin with. And in Vancouver, Washington, just across the border from Portland, Oregon, police have arrested a suspect in this shooting at the Vancouver Mall that left 1 man dead and 2 others wounded. A 32-year-old man taken into custody with the help of SWAT officers. Travis L. Ward, arrested around 6 p.m. on Saturday. Officers said they received numerous tips via Facebook when they arrived at a home where they suspected Ward was located. He surrendered and was taken into custody. Now faces charges of first-degree murder as well as 2 counts of first-degree assault, scheduled to appear in court on Monday. And according to OregonLive.com, Ward is a convicted felon, barred from owning a gun. He was previously convicted in 2019 in Washington County of being a felon in possession of a firearm, as well as unlawful use of a firearm, but wasn't sentenced until July of 2021. And when he was sentenced, Ward received 3 years of probation for being a felon in possession of a firearm, as well as unlawful use of a firearm. Now, we don't know what the underlying felony was that prohibited him from legally possessing a firearm. But we do know, again, that when he was arrested and charged with being a prohibited person in possession of a firearm, as well as unlawful use of that gun, Ward just got a couple years of probation. As part of his probation, Oregon Live says he was also ordered to undergo anger management. So that does suggest that the unlawful use of a firearm wasn't, randomly firing into the air. This wasn't target shooting when where you're not allowed to. This suggests that there was another individual who was the target of Ward's ire at that time, and still just a probationary sentence. To make matters even worse, in February 2023, his probation term was terminated early after he was deemed eligible for earned discharge from supervision. And here we are, about a year and a half later, and Ward now accused of murder. So we could talk about, all of the gun laws that Oregon supposedly needs and Washington State supposedly needs, but Washington State already has universal background checks. It's got a ban on so-called assault weapons. It's got a ban on so-called large capacity magazines. It's got a red flag law. It's got universal background checks. It also apparently has a problem putting violent offenders behind bars. And that is the real issue here. Now, today's Armed Citizen story from the state of Florida, where police in Hialeah, Florida say a mechanic killed a customer over a tire dispute, but it was self-defense. This customer apparently had a machete in his hand at the time that he was shot. This was on Saturday, about 1:30 in the morning on Saturday. Police responded to the scene of a shooting at West 2nd Avenue and 29th Street in Hialeah. Investigators say 36-year-old Michael Lope Montes de Oca had contacted a mobile tire repair service to come out and fix his vehicle. The mobile mechanic who arrived on the scene responded to the location, started working on the car, but at some point a confrontation took place between Montes de Oca and this mechanic, who has been identified in the media, but because he's a victim, I don't feel comfortable giving this guy's name out. But police say that Montes de Oca became upset after he realized that the tire that the mechanic had installed was a used tire. Detectives say that Montes de Oca threatened the mechanic and then charged at him with a machete in hand. In fear for his life, police say the mechanic took out his gun and fired, striking the customer multiple times. Police did take the mechanic into custody briefly, but later deemed the incident a, quote, justified shooting in self-defense. And so the mechanic not expected to face any charges. Again, you have the right to defend yourself when someone is coming at you with a machete. In Florida, you do not have a duty to retreat, but it doesn't sound like retreat was even a possibility at that point for the mechanic. And finally today, our good deed of the day, in the right place at the right time, willing and able to do the right thing. A man in Memphis who came to the aid of a 3-year-old who had wandered away from school, apparently without anybody noticing. This is truly frightening. Fox 13 in Memphis first broke the story last Thursday about 2 men finding and rescuing this 3-year-old child and returning him back to a Midtown school there. One of the Good Samaritans actually saw that report, reached out to Fox 13. Jerry Mimes was one of the 2 men who discovered that 3-year-old. He said, this is my friend for life right there, talking about the 3-year-old. Sharkana Norman, who's the mom of that 3-year-old, said she loves these Good Samaritans. She met the Good Samaritan thanks to Fox 13. They reached out, put the 2 together, along with her son, Covey. Mimes said, God sent me that way for a purpose, and the purpose was to save that little man right there. He said he was traveling on Peabody Avenue on Wednesday morning last week. It was about 9 a.m. He had his wife there with him in the car. And he said as they approached an intersection, that's when they saw this little 3-year-old just by himself. Mimes said he ran into the street, and I hit the brakes. My wife said, go get him. So I literally got out of the car in the middle of the street because no child has no business in a street like that by himself. And then they had to figure out, okay, where does this kid belong, right? He's 3, so your first thought isn't that he should be in school because he's too young for school. Maybe a daycare, maybe a nearby home. So they actually went door to door, Mimes and his wife, and they were asking neighbors, does anybody recognize this kid? One neighbor finally said, yeah, I think you need to take him to Bruce Elementary School. So Mimes said we walked down this way around the corner and thought, why is this child way around here when the school's way over there? Authorities still haven't really said how this 3-year-old was able to get out of the school. Police said the school did a head count while students were outside. They believe that Covey may have run off and blended in with other kids. But the Good Samaritan, as well as the child's mom, says they still don't understand how he ended up a block over without anybody noticing that he was gone. Jerry Mimes said he could have gotten hit by a car. Someone could have kidnapped him. So many endless possibilities that could have happened, but it didn't. The Lord sent me at the right place at the right time. And I can tell you, as somebody who wandered away from home when I think I was about 3, my family had just moved from Massachusetts to Oklahoma, and I was playing in the backyard. I was either 2 or 3. Somehow I got the latch undone, and I started wandering with our new dog, who at the time was only a few months old, and a very nice two older ladies, who actually, now that I think about it, maybe even younger than I am now, but 2 older ladies were nice enough to stop in the middle of a very busy 4-lane road because I was walking down the median with my puppy. And again, it was a matter of, I didn't know where I lived. I didn't know my address. But they went with police and eventually tracked down my mom, who was beside herself, and took me back home. So as I was reading this story about Jerry Mimes coming to the aid of this 3-year-old Covey, I don't remember this incident myself, so I couldn't have flashbacks, but I remember my family telling me about this time and time again, and I am so grateful that Covey had a guardian angel just like I did so many years ago. In the right place at the right time, willing and able to do the right thing. Jerry Mimes and his wife, we thank you for your very good deed. All right, that is going to do it for this edition of Bearing Arms Cam and Company. I want to thank you for being a part of the program as always. Looking forward to seeing you back here again tomorrow. The Election Day edition, we'll be talking about some of the big races to watch in terms of our right to keep and bear arms. Don't have too many ballot initiatives taking place at the local level. There are a couple of referendums we'll be talking about, but also some key Senate, House races. And then, of course, top of the ticket, what's going to happen between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump? Are we going to have somebody who pretends to support the Second Amendment, or somebody who actually believes what they say? And they say they support the Second Amendment in the White House for the next 4 years. Again, we'll be talking about that on Tuesday's Bearing Arms Cam and Company. I'm not going to hector you to vote, but you do know how important it is to get out there and make your voice heard. So please do that while you can. And we'll see you back here tomorrow. Until then, be well, be safe, and be free.